Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending the webinar here on 3 steps to optimal parts inventory. My name's Keith Ely, and welcome again to the webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this, and if you would like to listen to this again, we'll be posting the recording on our website, keaadvisors.com. Secondly, if you have questions today, please use the chat button. You'll see it probably down in the bottom ribbon of your Zoom screen. Just simply hit the chat button and type in your message, and just do it it'll ask you if you want to do it for everyone, or if you want to send it to one person in particular. If you'll just send that to everyone, please, and we'll see that chat come in. You can ask questions during the webinar, and we will either answer them at that point in time, or we'll save them for the end, and we'll be having time for questions after we get done today. We're planning on about a 30-minute presentation at most, and then leaving questions at the end of that for you to ask as well. So content-wise, we should not go over 30 minutes. And then we'll open that for questions. There's 2 other presenters with me today. Amber Kelzer, who's our Director of Business Intelligence. She is the brains behind everything we're going to talk about. And so welcome, Amber, to you.
Hello, thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to talk parts inventory with Key Advisors.
And then we also have Jeremy Smallwood from our firm on as well. So welcome, Jeremy, and thank you for taking time out as well.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
So Jeremy is actually at home recovering from the COVID today. So hopefully we're feeling better today. So again, what we're going to talk about today is a topic that we have dealt with a lot as a firm, certainly over the last 25 years of us being in business, but probably more so in the last, I would guess, 2 to 3 years. One is just driven by supply chain issues, but I think another is being driven by dealerships wanting to learn how to optimize this really large investment that they make with their own cash, and it's called parts inventory. We're actually going to be doing a series of 4 of these webinars, September, October, November, and December, around the parts department, and so this is our first one, and each session we'll talk about different pieces of the parts inventory. But this has taken a lot of attention with our customers. I looked, and in our 50 or so projects that we have going on right now, there's at least 20% of them that have something to do with a parts inventory, whether it's inventory turns, fill rate, staffing levels. All of it is related back to some part of the inventory. And so we will cover that, not necessarily today, but over the course of the next 4 months. As I said, this topic of the optimal parts inventory really has taken a big interest from our customers in the last 2 years. And I think it's because of, as I said, the investment amount, certainly the impact it has on gross profit, the impact it has on the customer relationship, the customer experience, first time fill rate, what happens with the shop. And then what we'll also talk about later on is what we'll call the variance, the physical variance, and which can relate to an accounting variance. Amber, Jeremy, anything else, just in terms of setting the stage for what we're going to talk about today, and why you think this topic is so important for our participants today?
Keith, I think you really touched on the largest point. Parts inventory is usually the #1 investment of a dealer, and we want to be great stewards of that investment as parts managers, parts directors. I think the second piece is that the inventory is truly the foundation of the performance of the parts department. If our inventory is the right size, the right quantity, we have the right part on the shelf at the right time for our customers, that really sets us up to focus in on sales and staffing and efficiencies throughout the department. Anytime our inventory isn't where we want it to be, you start to see that snowball down the line, whether it comes to sales and having the part when you need it, whether it comes to staffing and how efficiently and effectively can we pull and ship those parts. It all is tied into that firm foundation of, is our inventory what it should be?
And I agree 100% with both of you on that. Inventory is cash. It is cash that's sitting on the shelf. It's one of the biggest investments a dealer can make. And it's very important to keep it straight and organized in order to optimize the return on that cash.
Well, very good. That sounds great. Let's get started down this road today. So first of all, from a simple learning objective standpoint, there's three things that we would like to get done today. The first one is just determine why is around this, why this is needed. Secondly, we want to identify three basic steps to optimal inventory. And these three basic steps are not DMS specific. Okay, they're not manufacturer specific. What they are is three basic steps that we found over years of experience and time working with dealerships, either directly or as a parts manager or with visiting with dealers. These are tried and true steps that we found that really optimize the parts inventory. We're not going to get into the details of exactly how to go about doing them, okay? But there's some real meat here to start to dig into. And thirdly, to understand these actions. Amber, you're the brains again behind doing this. You're the one that starts to do the research and build these things out. Any clarifications or deeper dives you like to do on these learning objectives?
State the obvious. I like to control what you can control. I know you've heard me say that many times before. And when it comes to parts inventory, I always think learn the rules of the road and then learn to play them better than anybody else.
Very good. So let's talk about the why. Why are we doing this? Okay, why are we having this discussion about this idea of an optimal inventory? Well, the first reason is what both Jeremy and Amber spoke to before, the dollar investment. Other than the new truck inventory, which almost everybody floors that inventory, and maybe the used truck inventory, the parts inventory is the single biggest investment that a dealership makes. And from a cash standpoint, a cash out of pocket, this is the largest investment that is funded by the dealership. And it is a huge investment. Jeremy, I know that we were at a dealership last week together, and I think their inventory, if I remember right, was over $4.5 million, something like that. And it was a large inventory. And so these are not small investments. Secondly, and Amber, both you and Jeremy have spoke to this, but I'll let you talk a little bit more about the customer needs, the dealership customer needs and why this is so important to the dealership. So I'll let both of you take that and expound on that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, the number one customer of most parts departments happens to be the service department. And typically making sure that our inventory is accurate, that we're accounting for the demand that we're seeing against parts, and that we're servicing that service department really hits home in terms of profitability for both of the departments. I think the other piece is anytime a customer calls and asks us for a part, if we have to order that part and they have to wait, or we have to source it from somewhere else, we risk losing not just that sale, but future sales from the customer. And they really count on dealerships to have what they need when they want it.
Jeremy, anything you want to add to that? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, complete agreement. Especially as the marketplace gets more and more competitive, you really need to stand out, and you need to make sure that you have the right part on your shelf at the right time. If the shop comes to you and needs a part, they need to have that part now. They can't wait for it. So in today's climate, it's very imperative that that inventory is correct, not only accurate, but right part.
And I think both of you would agree that we can't have every part on the shelf, but you talked about the right part, Jeremy, knowing what the right part is and in the right quantity at the right time. We're going to talk some about variances, and I think that variances get in and of themselves are pretty easy to identify, but that root cause is really important here as we start looking at the variances. Amber, you talked about control, right? So explain that a little bit more if you don't mind.
Anytime I can control the outcome and then direct it where I want it to be, which is typically around profitability, I want to do that. And a lot of times, dealerships have vendor managed inventories. And that's my term for, Volvo System LPA or Navistar System DIA or RimPro, et cetera. Those OE driven inventory systems. And I would say those are great systems beyond them. They typically work well for you. However, something a lot of dealerships don't realize is they don't control 100% of your inventory. Based on all of the dealerships we've worked with over the last, 5 years, they only control about 65% of your inventory. And there's a lot of options in all of the major DMSs to help you control the other 35%, as well as maybe oversee your OE driven systems as well.
And I think that's the last piece here that we've got on the why, and it's understanding the impact of the vendor managed inventory, LPA, DIA, Parts I, RimPro, MDI, whatever those are. And you talked a little bit about that, Amber, but it's also, we would term that as a sanity check as well.
Mhm.
Is this really putting
Absolutely.
into my inventory what it wants or what we want? And what are we missing as well? What are we not getting on the shelf? So while we may not directly be able to control that 65 or 70%, we certainly can influence and
Yes.
and ask the right questions. So that's a real big piece of this. And it's something that I would guess, Jeremy, from your experience, that it's not just something that you allow somebody to sit out there and just do without understanding what that manufacturer is doing and why.
That's 100% right, because again, you want to control what you can control. You don't want them blowing up your inventory, but at the same time, you want to make sure that they're putting the right inventory on your shelf. So there are certain aspects of that vendor controlled inventory that you control, and you need to make sure that you're doing that.
Very good. Well, Amber, I'm going to let you take this next slide because this is your this is the basis and the basics of everything that you talk about. So I'm going to let you guide us through this slide, and I know we're going to get deeper into each of these three pieces of the roadmap.
Absolutely. For me, when I look at an inventory, the very first step is understanding what am I allowing to come into the shop and sit on my shelves? Because I want all the right parts in all the right quantities, but I do want to make sure I don't let something come in that's just going to sit there, get old, and I'm going to have to scrap it in a year and a half and not get any money back on it, or get 5 cents on the dollar back on it. So I call these guardrails. Now the DMSs sometimes call them IRO settings or stock controls. And for me, that's the sentry at the front gate, making sure only the right stuff comes in. And I think that's always where we want to start, no matter what your inventory looks like, to make sure that only from today forward, the good stuff comes in. I think the second piece is then identifying inside of your inventory, what's not moving. What percent of obsolete inventory do you have? We would suggest 2% or less is the KEA benchmark for obsolescence. A lot of times when we first start working with the dealer, we see that closer to 6 to 10%. And while we're working through some of the ways to remove obsolete inventory, it's also really important to understand what caused it. And by identifying that, we can start around 9 months and make sure that nothing becomes obsolete inventory. And last but not least is once we get our inventory right-sized and we're all fixed up, what are the daily routines to maintaining it? Just inventory integrity. Is the right part the right quantity? Do you know where it's at? Are you making sure as parts get set up that they're properly added to your inventory so they can be accounted for? Those are really the 3 steps that we're going to cover a little bit today.
And no, Amber, you also talk about this idea of routines, inventory routines. And so, that they become activities, they become things that you do. So I know that as we've talked through these routines and started to put them in place, we found that there's a lot of waste, not just waste on dollars, but in people's time, steps, if you will, space. Jeremy, I know that came up last week for us in our discussion with the dealer group we're at, was, just the space issue of not having parts on the shelf that shouldn't be there. So this whole idea of eliminating waste, certainly the idea of increasing the first time fill rate. Get it when it's asked for, we have it on the shelf. Both of you talked about the impact on the service department. Certainly our customer retention, the customer experience is driven by this as well. I know, Jeremy, again, going back to our experience last week with the customer we were at last week, in that group of, what do we have? Maybe 20 different locations represented. The fill rate and the discussion of control of the customer was a real big topic for them.
It definitely was.
We've also got this idea of lowering the inventory investment. So that kind of sounds contradictory, increasing the first time fill, but lowering the inventory investment, and it can be done. This, Amber, the next one I know to you is near and dear, which is the gross profit piece, right? Trying to, that we know that this impacts gross profit. And the last one, the impact of this is really to promote inventory transparency across the stores, so that people within our group, if we've got a group of stores, knowing a couple of things, that the part is on the shelf, we believe it's there, the count is right, we can find it, and knowing if we have access to that part, or if it's something that is an excess as well, or excess or obso that works. So that idea of transparency, and Jeremy, I'll come back to you again, this transparency that we talked about with this group of having a central phone room, having the online ordering, and really having to make sure that underpinnings of the inventory was correct. That seemed like it was a pretty big topic for that group last week.
It was, and especially a group that big with a phone room, that person in the phone room can't go out and check the bin every time he has a phone call. So that inventory has to be accurate. He has to know what's on that shelf in order to do his job.
Yeah. So it certainly has a ripple effect down the line that sometimes we don't think of. So, Amber, step one is this idea of stocking criteria. You talked about it also as a source control, I think, and a stock control, or a inventory replenishment. The stocking criteria has, in my mind, two basic pieces of it: breadth, which is our phase in, or what it takes to get the part on a shelf, what it takes to get it out of the shelf, a phase out, and then secondly, depth, the day's supply. And I'm going to come back to real quick before we get into this about this discussion we had around vendor managed inventory. We use the term reality when we talk about these things, and understanding what our reality is in terms of how often we order a part from a vendor. Is it a weekly cycle, a monthly cycle, a daily cycle? What's the delivery time on those? I know one of the things that you and your team have been looking at a lot through your Pulse product is lead times from the time the order is placed until it's receipted. What are you seeing along those lines when you guys have been looking at those lead times? Has it changed quite a bit over the last year?
Yes, and it's breaking our hearts.
Okay.
I'm sure that everybody's experiencing it.
Right.
We order a part, they say it'll be here in 2 days or 4 days or 2 weeks. And that day comes and goes, and then it didn't come in. A lot of times when we're ordering, we're using a gut check feel. And you guys have seen counter guys do it when it comes to lost sales. If anyone's ever seen a counter guy key in 1,000 pieces for one lost sale, because they feel like that part's never there and they're trying to override the system. The good news is the systems don't work that way, and they didn't hurt anything. The bad news is we're using our guts. And sometimes when we look at the data instead, we can identify that it always says it's going to come in 2 days. In reality, is it comes in 3. And we can check back on 5 or 10 orders and see that 3 really is the average amount of days for that type of order from that vendor to come in. And that's really the reality that we're looking for.
Okay. So I know as we start down this road, we first start talking about vendors, buckets of parts, if you will, that perform alike. So it could be, again, by the vendor, it could be by application, it could be by movement of the part. I know that there's a lot of things that we look at when we start to bucket these parts, if you will. Anything you'd like to add to that, Amber, in terms of a thought?
Sure. I think when we're talking about stocking criteria, to your point, we're looking at what is the phase in, phase out. So what is the demand against that part that would say, hey, we should put it on the shelf. And when that demand goes away, we should take it off the shelf.
Okay.
I think the other piece of it is when it comes to order times, from the time we order to the time we receive it, and the stocking levels we'd like to see, that's the level of performance you want in that bucket. Same phase in, phase out criteria, same type of ordering behaviors, because those are the pieces we're going to control, and the stock controls or the replenishment options. That's how we're going to set it up.
Okay.
So if we can bucket 5 or 6 classes or sources, depending on the terminology you're used to, it's going to make it easier. But we want to make sure those 5 do perform identically.
Gotcha.
Or as close to.
Gotcha. I know then we talk about the reality, which we talked about, this order cycle, the delivery time, and so forth, and understanding that's really important for your branch. And I think that what we know is that within an organization, a branch is going to have different realities, if you will, in terms of order cycles based upon minimum dollar amounts or delivery times based on where the PDC is that is coming from. And that really impacts that depth issue, right? That depth issue of the part. And then this idea of leveraging the DMS, right? And your vendor managed inventory to help you manage them, to help you manage your inventory, to do sanity checks, to give you an idea of what's missing, what the holes are, if you will, in both of those inventories, and starting to, if you will, marry them together to start to fill the holes. Jeremy, any thoughts around this idea of leveraging the business system and the vendor managed inventory system beyond what we've talked about?
Yeah, a lot of times people don't realize how much control they actually have over this. It's very important, number one, not only to have your DMS inventory set up properly as far as your source codes, your ordering points, because a lot of that, the DMS, the vendor management inventory, looks at and pulls from. So you have control over that. And 2, you also have control over what they actually look at and what they pull. So you have to manage it in order to make sure that it's working for you as well as it could be. Or again, it could mess up your inventory, it could inflate your inventory, or it could get to a point where you don't have the right parts on the shelf because of the way you have them set up in your DMS.
There you go. I think that one of the items that we all three agree on is that these vendor managed inventories are fantastic, right? I mean, we want to expose our parts to them so that they are allowed to work, because they've got a lot more data in looking at other dealerships, other regions, understanding breakdown trends and so forth. But we know that there's certain aspects of our inventory that we just say, these are our rules, and we follow those rules. You know, one of the things, Amber and Jeremy, that we've talked about internally, that we do internally a lot, is building this idea of day supply, of reorder points, whatever it is. This is an example of one of our spreadsheets. And I think the interesting thing when we start to look at this is that the days supply don't equal up to what the reorder point is, right? There's some math in there that we start to do, some statistics, but getting this data, these data points here are really important. Again, we use the term reality. What is your reality in managing this? So that's a really helpful tool we've built.
And I think it's important, especially for dealer groups with multiple stores, to realize that, you know, a store in Dallas, Texas has a different reality than a store in Garden City, Kansas. Yes, by the way, if you've never heard of Garden City, I'm from around there, and that's because it's so tiny you can't find us.
There you go.
But that means we're farther away and it takes longer to get things.
Right. The second step, Amber, you talked to was this idea of obsolete inventory. So, you know, this first identification of the obsolete parts, it's a pretty simple process, right? We're looking at parts that haven't moved over a certain period of time, typically over 12 or 13 months. But you start to ask some questions. The first one you always look at is, does it make sense if it's economically advantageous simply to transfer the parts. And talk a little bit about that, because this is, again, something I know you guys spend a lot of time on.
Sure. The older a part gets, the less money it's worth to you. And when we start to hit that 12, 13-month time frame, we may not be able to get the full refund back on that part or sell it for the full value in the dealership. In fact, we know we can't. But if you have multiple stores, the question is there another store that has a market that wants that part, that is selling that part? And so anytime that we can transfer that part, even if there's a small cost to moving it to that store, if that store can sell it at full retail price, we're going to get the most bang for our buck. And again, I use the term stewards, and I'm not going to lie, stole that from one of my favorite customers, because it really, to me, speaks to how we should manage that inventory, how to be a good steward of the trust that's placed in us by dealer principals when it comes to the investments that we're making. Hope you're muted.
My fault. I said you've ranked these in order of how to work through them. Your second one was simply, can we return the part?
And it's always based on what's going to give me the most bang for my buck. Can I sell it at retail? If I can't, can I return it within the return window to the vendor and maybe get 85% on a dollar back, or even credit back for the next order?
Jeremy, I know that this is something, again, that you've spent a lot of time on as well, just that this idea of making sure that the returns are timely, we're taking advantage of them. And not all the time is it 85 cents or $1 on $1. Sometimes it's much less. But to Amber's point, what's the best steward of the money?
And this is something I'm absolutely passionate about, is getting rid of this obsolete inventory. And on just this bullet point, returning to the vendor, there's a lot of times where you may be outside of that window. They have a 60-day or 90-day, 120-day return policy. But if you've got a good relationship with your vendor, there's a lot of times you can call them and work a side deal, is what I like to call them. Okay, we realize these are your parameters, but we have a certain amount of return we need to do. What can we do to make that happen? So it's an extremely important part of reducing that obsolete inventory. So anything you can work out with a vendor to get those parts back to them is going to benefit you in the long run.
And if we don't ask, we'll never get an answer too. The worst they're going to say is no. So,
right.
Yep. So the third thing that we talked to is, do we have a third party to sell them to? And of course, the last one is the dreaded scrapping them. Can you scrap them? And we don't want to get to that point, but sometimes it's a necessity. Going back, Jeremy, to the discussion we had last week, at some point that shelving space becomes much more valuable to you than that $10 widget that's on the shelf that sat there for 36 months taking up space on the shelf. And so that whole idea of when do we get rid of those parts? At some point, we know that's our last decision. But I think the bigger question here is that both of you have talked to is this: what's the root cause of the obsolescence, right? And we're not going to talk to that today, but I think really understanding that as you start to identify the obsolescence is not just identifying it and saying, okay, we got to do something with it. But I think the bigger question is, why did it get here and how did it get here? I think those are the questions that we have to start to answer. Jeremy, what's your number one thing that you look for in what causes obsolescence?
The number one thing that I consistently find is special orders.
Okay.
Somebody doing a special order, it coming in, being returned or incorrect, and it just being put on the shelf, nothing being done with it. That's a big cause. There are a lot of other things that we can get into, but that is one of the main ones that I consistently find. Yeah,
and I would agree with you. Amber, you start talking about, you got something you're going to say there, Amber. Go ahead.
I would take it even simpler. A lot of times I find obsolescence is created because we don't have the right guardrails to begin with.
Okay.
We are either using our gut to make orders or double orders, or have a part that is going to take 6 weeks to come in and we had one last month. And so we ordered 3 instead of 1. But having the right guardrails to begin with, to me, is the biggest keeper of the obsolescence.
Okay. I know, Amber, that again, we say this is a routine, right? That's what we've talked about. These are routines. And I think this one is a really, really important thing. And I'm gonna let you
Yes.
expand on that a little bit.
We get really busy chasing fires in any department, but especially in parts with our customers, with back ordered parts, with service asking for something. And we don't always look at what are the daily, weekly, monthly routines we can execute to keep things running smoothly. And honestly, the second we get behind, the larger the fires get. And so making sure that we look at our vendor returns and we understand when they're coming up and that we have a plan to complete them in a timely manner, which again, maximize the return we're going to get. Just really starting those routines early and making sure we have a plan for them can save you a lot of stress and scrambling down the road.
So we've got this idea of obsolete inventory. I'm just going to add one aside to this. This is not just even obsolete inventory. That's where we start. But we could also put the term excess in here as well, understanding why we have excess on the shelf. Sometimes it's needed, especially today. We're making those decisions, but sometimes it just gets here by accident or we don't understand why. And so your idea of the guardrails and going back to the guardrails and understanding why did we get this excess inventory and what do we do with it? How do we keep it from happening again? It's all about cash. So step 3 is this idea of daily inventory integrity. And I will tell you the most key word on this is daily. It doesn't say weekly. It doesn't say monthly. It doesn't say annual. This is a daily event that has to happen. And Jeremy, the first one I'm going to put up here is one I know that you just get really passionate about, start jumping up and down about, in fact. So you're going to talk a little bit about cycle counts.
They're extremely important. I mean, if we're waiting till the end of the year to do an inventory, how many mistakes are being made that are just magnifying over the course of the year? Daily cycle counts are of utmost importance in what we're doing with the inventory. And I can go deeper if you'd like, but there are certain things that you can do to make those easier, make them more accurate. But again, it's number one on the list for a reason.
Yep. And I think that, the pushback, Jeremy, that we get, and we don't need to get into detail here, but the pushback that we get is, I don't have enough people and I don't have enough time. But I know that you found workarounds. We've got customers that have found ways to make this happen, not with staffing more people, but just understanding work schedules, workflow, the timing of orders that come in and so forth. And so that's really important. The second thing that we talk about with our customers is this idea of understanding the new parts that were added yesterday. And on this slide, these are all exceptions, by the way. So the cycle counts, the exception is that, to Jeremy's point, we had an error. The exception on a new part added is that we expect the part to be there. And so it's not just reporting on it, but it's understanding a couple of things. Why was it added? If it should have been on the shelf, why was it not on the shelf? And maybe most important, is the costing right? Is it in my right bucket? And is it so that it prices right and so forth? But really getting a good feel of these. And again, Jeremy, when we looked at these last week, we found just in a random search, I think we found from the prior day, 2 or 3 part numbers that were set up wrong. The part number was wrong, a variety of things. So that just causes problems down the line. We talk about stock out reports. These are parts that have qualified for stocking status. Going back, Amber, to your idea of guardrails, they've qualified for phase in. They've got enough demands, but they have 0 on the shelf, nothing on order. And this is something we spend a whole lot of time on. We've talked about credit memos. We haven't talked here about it, but we spend a lot of time on understanding the parts that come back that we write credit memos on, and did they get to the right shelf in the right quantity. A few more of these. Jeremy, this was something we saw last week that was interesting, both this one and the next one, which was parts with no cost. Talk a little bit about why this is important to understand, Jeremy.
First and foremost, it affects your perpetual and your GL. Your cost of that part was received. So it was received at a cost at one point, but now it's on your shelf for 0. And two, that could affect whether you go off of actual cost or your inventory has it set up. That could affect your inventory, and that'll create that variance between the GL and the perpetual.
It certainly has pricing issues too, if you're going cost plus,
Mhm.
you know.
Oh gosh, please don't go cost plus.
We try not to, right?
I have a
We try
strong
not to.
soapbox, folks.
Yeah. We look at something called parts with no bin or no physical bin. Okay, if there's no physical bin location set up for that part with the quantity on hand, how are you ever going to find it? And our last one that we start to look at, or the second to last, is negative on hands. And then, Jeremy, I'm going to let you take this last one. Both you and Amber can take this one, because I think this one is, again, something that we hear about, but we the three of us know the impact that this has on this idea of the right part on the right shelf in the right quantity.
You have to capture the demand. Definition, lost sale. You have somebody ask for a part and you cannot walk to the shelf and pick it up. You have to order it, go down the street, whatever it might be. If you cannot walk to the shelf and pick it up, it is a lost sale. Even if you order it and they come in tomorrow to buy it. And the reason is we want to capture that demand for that stocking criteria. And make sure that if we should have it on the shelf, that it does eventually get put on the shelf and in the right quantity based on that lost sale.
Yeah. Okay. Jeremy, you want to add to any thoughts to that?
Well, and this is the fight that has been fought since the dawn of parts time, I think. Counter guys hate doing lost sales. I don't understand why, they just do. You have to get over that. You have to teach them, train them, make it a game, do something to get them to start doing these lost sales. They're so imperative to, as Amber spoke about, putting the right parts on your shelf when you need the parts. Why did you not have the part? And lost sales, one of the most common arguments you always get is, well, it's going to create a double demand if I hit the button and put a lost sale, but I had to order it and we ordered it and then sold it. So now it's hitting two. Well, there's a math equation to that. And if you do the math and equate that out, you'll see that it doesn't affect your inventory the way you think it does. Creating that lost sale is extremely important. That's what affects your inventory. That's what's going to tell you what you need on the shelf.
Yeah, and I think, Jeremy, to come back to what you said, is the fear is that if I record that double demand, I'm gonna have twice as many parts. It'll affect it, but not very much. It'll affect it, right? Right now, we have trouble getting a lost sale recorded. I think I'd worry about getting a lost sale recorded before I'd worry about too much right now. So we've talked about our three things that drive this optimal inventory, but Amber, I'm going to let you walk us through this slide. The first thing you just talk about is this idea of understanding where we started at, and just talk to us about you interact a lot with your customers on this slide right here.
Everybody should start with a baseline. Where are you at today? If you're going to start to make change, know where you're at. That way you can see the progress as it happens, because it doesn't happen overnight and it does happen incrementally. But as you look back over 2 months, you might see your fill rate went up a couple points. You're going to start to see that your inventory value might have even gone down $100,000 as your fill rate went up. Your obsolescence is going to go down. And that momentum, seeing the change, tying your team to why it matters, really helps gain the momentum. Folks are competitive. Make it a competition. Help them understand where the finish line is. And then celebrate those wins. Celebrate that incremental progress so that you gain the momentum and the excitement within your team to do the right thing.
I think that whole idea of a scoreboard or something that where you can keep a score and see it and monitor it and measure it and understand what you're talking about here is really, really important.
When our teams understand the whys, and then we hold them accountable, and accountability can be a very positive thing. That's really what we all want in our jobs, is to make sure that everybody's held to the same standard. Those two things can really, really gain momentum and help you get results and make your team feel valued in the process.
I think about, and Kent's on this call. He has one of his customers that he's been working with for several years, and the momentum that they've picked up on the parts side in terms of both a decrease in inventory, and I don't know the exact number, but it is a significant decrease in inventory. Probably, I'd guess around 10% of the inventory value. But the impact that they've felt being driven by what we've talked through in terms of getting the right part on the shelf. I think their real fill rate right now is in the upper 80s. And for this point in time, that's pretty good. The obsolescence is becoming almost nil, and they understand the obsolescence. They understand that they've got 3 or 4 pieces of body equipment, dump beds that have been in that they choose to put in their parts inventory. That's what's making up most of their obsos. So, understanding that and the why and the how, but really reporting on it on a really consistent basis, and knowing when you win and why you lose too is really, really important, because you can act on it. You can act on it.
And
Jeremy,
remember,
anything you got? Go ahead, Amber. I'm sorry.
I would just say, remember, this is the foundation. When your parts inventory is in the right shape, everything else is going to run smoother,
Yeah.
from sales to margin to service. Having the right parts, that's the stable foundation we're looking to build on.
Very good. Jeremy, anything you'd like to close us up with on this tab, or we're going to move into questions that our audience might have?
Again, it's about, as Amber referred to, the guardrails, setting up those daily routines and then measuring your progress as you go along.
All right. So we talked about several learning objectives. First of all was to determine the why this is needed. And it's really about cash, the customer experience, what it does to the service department, and understanding all the things that cause those big things that we talked about to get out of bounds. Secondly, as we talked about, the 3 basic steps to the optimal inventory. And those 3 basic steps were, first of all, setting up the guardrails. Secondly, understanding and identifying the obsolete inventory. And third, the daily inventory integrity items and actions to do. The last one is understanding the actions needed. And so again, digging into these 3 steps and then the actions that are needed to make it happen. So Jeremy, and Amber, I appreciate you guys taking time. Let's see what questions we have. We may have we have one here. So yes, the copy of the recording will be on our website, keaadvisors.com. And also, if you've attended, you'll get a link to that as well. Any other questions before we call it a noon hour Central Time anyway? Any other questions from our audience?
Yes, sir. I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Josh Vernlin, Rapid City. We're starting to get a physical inventory, and I'm seeing that a lot of items are not in the inventory and seem to be quite old. What is the recommendation as far as, should I add them to the inventory so I know what we have, or try to facilitate like an additional location to try to dispose of them, or should I just put them on the inventory and then deal with it later?
Hey, Josh, I'm going to ask you a favor, if you don't mind. Can we take that question offline? If you don't mind sending me an email, I'm going to have Jeremy Smallwood get in touch with you, and you guys can talk about that. If you
Too
don't
easy.
mind doing that.
That works.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate that. Any other questions?
We have a question about more information about how to do daily cycle counts without having to hire more people.
All right. Jeremy, I'm going to let you take that.
So a couple of things that I've done in the past that seem to work very well. The first thing, and of course, this takes buy-in from your dealer principal. Obviously, you need him to back you on this. What I've always said is, you never want the fox watching the hen house. You don't want your parts manager going out, counting his own inventory, doing his own adjustments, readjusting the inventory. So I would always go and get somebody from the service department, the accounting department, truck sales. I would get somebody outside of the parts department to do the cycle count for me. Now, when people hear that, they automatically kind of bristle up because they're like, "What?" If you keep it simple, and keep the list short, where it takes them 10, maybe 15 minutes to do a cycle count. They don't seem to balk at it too much. And it can be kind of a game because somebody in another department is checking on your parts department. So they're trying to find something to catch you with. It keeps the integrity of the inventory. It frees your time up because you have somebody else doing it for you. And it keeps everything transparent. If there's a mistake, there has to be somebody outside the department to verify that mistake and that the mistake was fixed or corrected. The other thing that I've tried in the past is whoever my first person is in the day, whether it be a warehouse person, parts manager, it's their responsibility to do that before we're even open for business. And again, keeping it short, where it's not 200 part numbers at one time, where it's taking them an hour and a half to do, but just keeping it simple, keeping it short, letting them do it, and then have somebody double check that. Those are just two of the ones off the top of my head that I can think about.
So I'm going to add to that, Jeremy, and thank you for that. I'll add a couple of more. So we talked about understanding the timings that happen in your department. So for some of you, you receive stock orders early in the morning and you're putting those up early in the morning. And so those, you could not do a cycle count during those times. But if you find that activity starts to drop after lunch, in that example, maybe after lunch is when you've got a 30-minute window to take 2 or 3 people to go do those cycle counts, or vice versa. We were at, again, the dealership we were at last week, their stock inventory is coming in mid-morning. The early morning is not as busy in that warehouse. It's not saying it's not busy, it's just not as busy. So again, who can I take during that time to go do those cycle counts? I think to what Jeremy said in terms of time is really important. This shouldn't take over 30 minutes a day. If it's really taking over 15 or 20 minutes a day, that's probably too much. Now, it may not be that you have just one person doing it. You may have 2, 3 people doing it based upon the size of the inventory. And you can do the math and figure out how many bins or part numbers you need to calculate. But really getting and let's be really clear, the first 1 or 2 times you do it, it's going to suck. It's not going to take you 30 minutes in some cases to get through it because the condition that the shelves are in. But as you get doing this, it becomes something that becomes a regular part of the routine. Jeremy talked also about this idea of getting people to buy into it. And I agree with that, but there's also a compliance issue. We are going to cycle count, right? We are going to do that. And so, and you 3 people are going to do that. So I think number one, understanding timing. I love the idea of being able to utilize people from outside my department for 15, 20, 30 minutes a day to do that. I think, again, it removes a lot of the conflicts of interest. The idea of the time frames when you can do it, really getting an understanding of how your business system will produce the cycle count bin sheets, if you will, or if it can be done via a scan gun or whatever's the easiest way. It's not something just to go out and start this afternoon. There's some research that has to be done, but again, it can be done if you'll spend a little bit of time being creative, maybe lay it out to your team. I think one of the most creative things I have ever seen from a dealer group was assigning the entire department, all the people of that department, to areas of the inventory. And their job, if they had 20 people in the parts department, they might have 5 areas. And so 4 people each from that department were assigned to an area. Their job is to count it, to keep it clean, to own that area of the department. And again, that includes the cycle count, but there's other pieces of keeping the cleanliness on that. So again, be creative, maybe engage your staff in it, understand why it's important. And it's important because if we have the correct counts, you don't have to leave the counter. You don't have to get off the phone. You can trust it's what's in the system. Our ordering works right. Our customers are more happy, and so on. And there's a lot of positive whys behind that.
The more consistent you are at doing cycle counts, the less time it will take you to do cycle counts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Mary Ruth. Appreciate it. Any other questions this afternoon? Let's see, we've got one. Yep. Thank you. You're welcome, Kevin. If you want more information on any of these, reach out to Jeremy at keadvisors.com, Amber at keadvisors.com. If you also want more information, you can go to our website. You can go to the Three Wise Truck Guys. Our last podcast that we had was on this subject with one of our customers. You might find some nuggets there of information. You also can look at truck parts and service at actually an article that came out yesterday that Amber authored in regards to these items. So if you have any other questions, we'd certainly take them. Otherwise, we appreciate your time today very much. All right. Thank you, everybody. Jeremy, Amber, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
All
Goodbye,
right. Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.